We've got some breaking news to break down on today's episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball, and I am joined today by no one. It's just me. AJ is not here today on the podcast. If you're a longtime listener, you may be wondering, what is going on? Where is AJ? Have no fear. AJ will be back with us next week. The reason why he's not on today's a bit of a different episode, something that we've not really done before on the podcast, but seemed necessary to do. We don't get much by way of breaking news in the church world much. It's not really how we operate. That's not our speed, but there is some new research that has come out from Pew Research that is kind of breaking news, if I'm being honest with you. This is the 2020 census of American religion from the Pew Research Institute, and it's really worth diving into here. Now, you may have seen some headlines pop up on your news feed from even mainstream sources that are trying to diagnose the implications of this data, and those are not necessarily your most reliable actors. They maybe aren't good faith actors in diagnosing the implications of that data for your church. And so I thought it would be good for us to spend a little bit of time today drilling down into the data that has been discovered in this research and what it means for you and your church. And so we've come up with 3 points, 3 insights that I think that have practical application to your church right now and how you operate. And so this is something of a breaking news episode, and we wanted to get this out to you this week so that you can begin to digest this. So if you haven't seen the research, I would encourage you to go ahead and download it. The nice thing is it's completely free to download. Just Google what I just told you, the 2020 Census of American Religion. There's a lot of good information in there. It's about 60 pages. It even is able to go in county by county, and I'm not going to dive into all of that. I just want to hit the broad strokes, 3 key insights that apply to your church. So let's start. Let's dive in. Insight number 1. The evangelical church is declining faster than any other religious group in America. According to this study, since 2006, white evangelical Protestants have experienced the most precipitous drop in affiliation, shrinking from 23% of Americans in 2006 to 14% in 2020. Now, I want to pause here for just a second and push back against one of the premises of this entire research. The research was conducted, and I understand it. I don't want to knock them too hard. They have to kind of create a framework, and the framework through which they explore a lot of this is through a racial lens. So the categories that they're even exploring are things like white Protestant evangelical, white Protestant non-evangelical, or mainline. So your typical Presbyterian, Methodist, whatever. African American Protestant, Hispanic, Catholic, white Catholic. So you have these sort of racial breakdown categories. And so it's maybe a bit of an unfair breakdown of even how American religion works to assume, for example, that all evangelical denominations are predominantly white. I'm not quite sure that that's a fair assumption to make. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to just go along with their assumptions here, because it's the only thing that we can operate off of. But I just want to say on the front end, I'm not sure that some of these categories are particularly fair, but all things being equal, if we think of it, at least in terms of the evangelical church, even if you don't want to consider it all white, which I don't think is a fair assumption, the evangelical church, even if it is labeled historically white, is declining faster than any other religious group. That's a fact. So again, according to this study, there's been a drop in affiliation from 23% of Americans identifying as evangelical in 2006 to 14% in 2020, and no other religious group in the U.S. has seen that kind of a drop, that steep of a drop. Going back years, we have typically pointed to the more liberal mainline denominations and seen their declines. Their declines have had been steep, but theirs have leveled off, and in fact, in some ways, have increased. This is their shares actually they have grown. So the mainline denominations have grown in the recent years, which, again, if you're going to read some of the headlines from the mainline or from some of these mainstream news sources, they're going to celebrate that as some sort of a win, as if maybe these churches are doing something that evangelical churches are not doing. But I think that what's actually happening here, if you really dive down into the data and kind of look at the trends, what appears to be happening is large numbers of evangelicals, particularly young evangelicals, are leaving the church, many of whom are simply becoming religiously unaffiliated. They're not identifying with any religion. And then another chunk of those that are peeling off from historically evangelical churches are joining up with more liberal mainline denominations. And so it's not as though there's been some great outreach program happening in the mainline denominations that we need to look to. They've merely been benefactors of the decline in evangelical circles, is what I perceive to be happening. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. I'm fairly certain that that's what's happening. But the main headline here that you need to care about at your church, if you're an evangelical church, which most of our podcast base is that we're losing influence. We're losing influence. We can't deny that that's true. It's true. It's fact. And we have to confront that reality and deal with it. And evangelicals have to recapture the core word embedded in our name, in our label, which is evangelism. To be evangelical at its core is supposed to be about evangelism, and that we are people who believe in evangelism, that we believe in the Great Commission. We're Great Commission people, that we understand that evangelism comes from Evangelion, good news. We're supposed to be people of good news, and we have gotten away from this. We have the honor and privilege of working with churches all across the United States, all across North America, and even around the world. But one of the things that I've noticed in my work with churches across North America especially is a move away from evangelism. Churches that are supposed to be evangelical aren't sharing their faith. They're not doing it corporately. They're not doing it individually. And there is not a felt pressure to do so. What there is a felt pressure to do is fight the culture war, to get really active, to get out there in the streets and to fight for politically, to fight for a political candidate, to fight for certain cultural issues. And I believe that this has been a mistake. I want you to hear me clearly. I think that we can't get away from biblical convictions. We ought to care about unborn children. We ought to care about issues of life and things like that. These things are important. But a political commentator has famously said that politics is downstream of culture, and I would contend that culture itself is downstream of the church and its failures. And so what has happened, I believe, is that as the church and churches have become more political, we've inversed the way things ought to operate, and we're trying to go after downstream issues versus trying to deal with upstream issues. And if we can deal with the issues upstream, the downstream will take care of itself. But we ought to restore our role as being a place where we're about the good news. If we can be about the good news, we don't need to worry about the things that are downstream. Right? If we have fully redeemed people who know who they are in light of Scripture, who know who they are in Christ, these other issues start to resolve. And so I believe that one of the implications for our churches is that we have to get just laser focused on being about the good news. Recapture the evangelism in Evangelical and be about the good news. So there's bad news. Evangelicalism has declined. Undeniably, that's true. In the last 15 years, that's happened. But it's not too late. But the more we're focused on fighting the culture war, the less we are focused on evangelism, the more we're going to lose. And it's not because I don't care about cultural issues. Don't hear that. It's not because I don't care about the craziness that we see in society. It's that I believe that the solution to that problem is the gospel, and we ought to be focused on that first. Okay. Insight number two. American Christianity is more diverse than ever before. That's a fact. Now, Christianity in the U.S. is less white than it ever has been, although this shift is slow. So according to the study, in 2020, around 1 in 4 Americans, when you look at America as a whole, 1 in 4 Americans were Christians of color, 26%. And this is up a couple of percentage points since 2006. So this is a reflection of the increasing diversity in the United States. Your leadership and your church ought to reflect the shifting demographics of your specific community. So this is going to vary from community to community. Depends on where you live and how the demographics are shifting or not shifting or whatever. But this is a good reminder, I believe, based on this research, that your church ought to be a reflection of the community where you live, not as an act of tokenism. I want to be really clear about this. Some mistakes that I'm seeing from churches is that they're going, we need to be diverse. And so they're making diverse hires and they're going after trying to reach a particular population for the goal of diversity as an end to itself, which I believe is misguided. Going back to point number one, I believe that your church ought to be diverse, but that diversity ought to be a reflection of genuine outreach and care for your community. If we're reaching out to our neighborhoods and our neighborhoods are diverse, our church will be diverse because our neighborhood is diverse and because we are reaching it. We don't have to do it in a forced way. We don't have to do it in a way that it embraces some sort of fake tokenism. We don't have to do, no affirmative action required. If we are people of the good news and we are genuinely reaching our community, which we largely are not as a whole, but if we were to do that, if we were to meet the needs of the people in our community, we were to actually reach those people, the demographics of our church would change. And so the reason why I bring this up, if diversity isn't the ends that we're trying to achieve, why even bring up this point? Might be a question that you're thinking and asking. It's a fair question. The reason I bring it up is if you look around your church and it's not diverse, that is a signal that we are failing at evangelism. So if you look around your church and it doesn't reflect in any way the community where you live, that is a sign that we're not doing a good job actually reaching the community where we live. I hear a lot from churches, hey, our community has changed, but it's the same people who were here 20 years ago, and now we're a commuter church. We used to be a community church, and now we're a commuter church. What do we do? We've got folks who are driving in 30, 40 minutes from other places in town. And, it's hard to get them to serve and make a connection with people in this community because they live so far away. I hear all of that. But the reality is that your church either needs to move to where your people actually are, or you need to decide once and for all that you are going to be a church that reaches your community. And you've got to do whatever it takes to be people of the good news in the community where you are, in the place where you are, reaching the people who are right there where you are. And if you are to do that, diversity will be a natural byproduct of that outreach. But I bring up the fact that America is more diverse as a bit of a mirror for you to look at yourself and go, okay, are we reflecting our community or are we not? So number two is that American Christianity is more diverse than it ever has been before, which means your church should be more diverse than it ever has been. And if it's not, that's an indication that we're not reaching our community. More interestingly, and this is going to connect with my third insight here, my final insight from this data, is that in younger generations, okay, white young adults are less likely to be Christians than younger adults of color. So, for example, African American Protestants account for 8% of all Americans 65 and older. Okay, so if you look at all Americans 65 plus, 8% of that demographic identify as African American Protestants. If you look at all Americans age 18 to 29, 5% of that group identify as African American Protestants. And so within that racial demographic group, there is a decrease in adherence by 3% relatively speaking, which is a decrease, but it's modest, it's slight. By comparison, if you look at Americans age 65 plus, 22% of that group identify as white evangelicals. Okay, 22% of all Americans age 65 plus identify as white evangelicals. It's roughly 1 in 5. Only 7% of Americans age 18 to 29 identify as white evangelicals. Wrap your brain around that. It's a third, roughly. So you are more likely, significantly more likely, to be religiously unaffiliated if you are white and under the age of 30. This is an indicator that we are failing at reaching young people. The white evangelical church is bleeding young people far more than any other demographic group is bleeding young people, right? The African American church is doing a better job reaching its youth than historically white churches are doing at reaching their youth. That's the point I want you to hear here, which leads to the third and final insight I want you to capture. The evangelical church, strip the race from it, okay? Evangelical churches are getting older and they're failing to reach young people. So according to this study, evangelical Protestants are the oldest religious group in the United States. Out of all of the groups, evangelical Protestants are the oldest group. The average age, the median age is 56. And that compares to the median age of all Americans is 47. So almost 10 years older than the median age of the country. And the median age of the religiously unaffiliated people is 38. Wrap your brain around that one for a minute. So the average age of a person who doesn't go to church, who isn't connected with any religious group at all, is having kids, while evangelical Protestants are getting close to retirement, starting to have grandkids maybe, and maybe their kids are not in church anymore. Their grandkids maybe aren't in church. Evangelical churches must place a disproportionate amount of energy and resources into recapturing this generation, the next generation. You have to. And one of the mistakes that I see a lot is folks who are leading churches tend to be older. There's research on this as well. I believe that the average age of a pastor right now in America is something like 62. Maybe after upper 50s, lower 60s, something around there, which lines up really similarly with the study we're seeing from Pew. And there's a hyper focus on thinking that millennials, there's somehow this conception that millennials are like teenagers. And I've got some other breaking news for you. Millennials, the oldest millennials now are 40 almost. 40 years old, maybe 40 years old. They're not teenagers. They're middle-aged, just about. Okay, so and that spans down. So the youngest millennials are in their late 20s. So you've got this group that's in their 30s, mid 20s or so to their late 30s. That's that millennial generation that everyone thinks is just some young whippersnappers. They're not. And this is also the group that is most likely to be associated with that religiously unaffiliated crowd, and then their kids. We've got the Gen Z crowd that's even more likely to associate with being religiously unaffiliated. This is a real problem. It's bleeding. We're bleeding young people like crazy. And so the evangelical church, I'm telling you, if you are an evangelical church, you have to place a disproportionate amount of energy and resources in reaching the millennial generation and their kids. Don't just think about the current teenagers, but think about those who are, what are you doing to reach people who are 30, 35 years old? What are you doing to reach those families, those young families? This means leveraging technology in new and innovative ways. I know that you made a lot of changes in COVID. You started streaming services, and you got active on Facebook. It's not enough. It's not enough. We've got to be better. We've got to be really good at the technology stuff. I'm tired of pastors saying, I'm not really into the technology, and pretending like it's no big deal. It's a huge deal. Take time to learn what you need to learn so you can engage with people online. Your churches have to get better at this. We have to have a presence online. We have to be good at doing this stuff online. Start a podcast. That's not just streaming your sermons. Don't just plop your sermons online. Do things where you're actually looking at the camera and talking to people and engaging people and creating content. People are not less interested in religion, but evangelical Christians have become less interesting because we don't have anything to say. We just want to argue. We just want to fight. We just want to engage in these culture wars. And again, I'm not telling you to back down from your convictions. I'm just asking you to be about the good news. If you would be good news to young people still want to hear good news. I believe that. I firmly believe that. The final point I want to make here on the evangelical church is getting older is that you have to accelerate the development and platforming of young leaders. You got to elevate the next generation of leaders in your church. Does that mean some guys are going to have to retire? Maybe. I would love to see is situations where older leaders are serving alongside the next generation of leaders, where instead of it being an on-off switch, why not move towards retirement by bringing on a younger guy, training him up, giving him an opportunity to grow into the position while you slowly move towards retirement and maybe go part-time before you retire. There's all kinds of models for succession that work really well. And I'm not trying to force anyone out of a job and say, let's get all these old people out of there. What I am saying is that you have years and years and decades of experience that's going to go wasted if it's not invested in the next generation. So it's not about trying to move you out of a spot. It's about you need to impart that wisdom now in the next generation of leaders. You need to, if you want to have, you got to become legacy minded. You got to think about the impact that you are making on the next generation of leaders. So I'm sad to say that in this breaking news episode today, there's not a lot of good news, but you can become people of good news. You can become people of good news. We can become churches of good news, and we can reverse these trends. These trends are not final. These trends are not fate. We have an opportunity to rise up and make an impact in our community, and I want to invite you to do that. If you are confused about what any of this means for your church, if you're wondering where would we even get started, let me give you a firm place to start. Figure out where your church is at and how your church is performing by taking a church ministry analysis. This is a service that we offer to churches that's a comprehensive church survey, health survey, church health assessment. We call it the church ministry analysis, and it's $99, okay? This is not something that we're only charging you anything. We're not making money on it. We're charging money so that you'll actually follow through on all the steps and reply to emails and do the things you need to do. It includes us talking with your church leaders, walking through your report. We handwrite these reports, by the way. We don't, it's not an auto-generated thing. So go to malfirstgroup.com, malfirstgroup.com/CMA, sign up for that. It's a great place to start. It's low commitment. You don't have to agree to anything except doing that assessment. It's going to help your church figure out how are we doing and what do we need to be doing? How do we need to be focused moving forward? Secondly, I would say our strategic planning process. If you're ready to go, no, we already know where we're at. We've got a good snapshot of where we are, but we need to get started on strategic planning and planning for the future. We're a nonprofit organization, so we're priced accordingly. You can go to malfirstgroup.com, click on our strategic planning stuff. You can see self-guided options. You can sign up today for strategic envisioning online. It's an online version of our strategic planning process that is really affordable, and you could start today on that. You can sign up today for that. If you need help and you want a guided process, you can download a proposal for our process and see what costs are associated with that. See if it's a good fit, something you can schedule a meeting with us to talk about, but you don't have to schedule a meeting with us to see all of our what the process is like and the pricing and all of that. You can go right online and download a proposal. So go to malfirstgroup.com and see that. I believe in the work that we are doing at the Malfirst Group. I know that it's changing the course of churches. I am seeing the churches that I'm working with breaking every trend that they were of decline that they were in. And I know that your church can do it. I know that your church can change. I know that your church can be an outlier against these trends that we're seeing in this research that's just come out. But nothing changes until you do. But if you decide to be a church about the good news and engage your community and elevate young leaders, man, it's off to the races. There's no doubt what your church can do by the power of the Holy Spirit. Because God wants to use your church to make a difference. He does. I still believe in the church, and I still believe that Jesus wants to use your church. So let's take this hit on the chin from this data, and don't lower our head, but raise our head up, set our eyes on Jesus, and do what he has called us to do. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast. You can download today's show notes, get some links to this research and some other things at malfirstgroup.com/98. Download that show notes and take a look at it. Also, if you're watching the YouTube version of this podcast, check out the team discussion guide in the description below. If you're listening, go to the Malfirst Group, youtube.com/the Malfirst Group. See this episode, watch this episode. I encourage you, this would be a great one to watch with your team to break down this data and have some discussions about it and what are the implications of this data for your church. So we love you. Our whole team at the Malfirst Group does. AJ will be back with us next week as we dive into another topic on the Church Revitalization Podcast. We'll see you next time.